Okay, so let's get into 4C. So there's a little bit, again, we're just going to keep working on anatomy and physiology. We'll look at some of the muscles and some of the movement patterns from these specific muscles, okay? And we'll try and keep it quite simple, and we'll try and, have, sort of real life examples and stuff like that. It's always a good idea to put it in terms of a real life example, okay? So as you can see here, mate, on 8.1, you can see that we've got this muscular chart, right? And we're just going to have to go through all these different muscles and talk about their prime movements, okay? So do you understand what like a prime mover for of a muscle is?
Their primary movement.
Yeah, so it's what the muscle's like primarily responsible for. You know what I mean? So, for example, like the biceps, it's prime movement. It's a prime mover of elbow flexion, which is bending the elbow. It also helps a little bit with like pronation and supination, like when you turn your arm over. But it's primary movements. That's really what we're going to be kind of talking about there. So you can see number 1 there. Okay. So what's number 1 on that image?
Where are we? It's anterior delt.
Yeah, so that's the anterior deltoid. Yeah, so we can put that down for 1 would be the anterior deltoid. Yep. And then what would be, so you can see there, that's obviously how we name it. And then the second part is the action. So during concentric contraction, when that muscle is shortening, what is the primary movement of that muscle? Maybe we can think about
abduction.
Yeah, it would be abduction. So moving the arm out to the side. Yeah. The anterior deltoid is its prime mover. Okay, that's very good.
Okay. So just write
shoulder. So it'd be shoulder abduction. So you always want to write. Yeah, you always want to write the joint and then the movement at that joint. So that's what it's primarily responsible for. Okay. It also has a small role in shoulder flexion. So lifting your arm up in front of you. Like if you ever do like front raises or plate raises or something like that, it does that as well. Okay.
Okay, so I'll put that down as well.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Just
shoulder flexion.
Yeah, shoulder abduction, shoulder flexion. Okay, so what's number 2?
Number 2 is the pec major.
So pec major. Yep. So what would be its prime movement?
Is shoulder. I forget what it's called.
So let's think about some gym movements. So if you did like a pec fly,
pec flies.
Like a pec fly. So what's the movement of that joint?
Your adduction.
Yeah, adduction. So it's shoulder adduction. So adding the arm back to the body, and also what's very important is horizontal adduction. Yeah, so it's in the horizontal plane. So think about like the cable crossover machines in the gym or the pec fly or something like that. So that's all adduction and horizontal adduction.
That's right. We touched on that last week, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so obviously like a football player's perspective, like pecs are super important for tackling, right? Because that's the grapple and the grip and the squeeze and all that sort of stuff, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So 3 is, what's 3?
3 is the bicep.
Yeah, so just biceps. You might write biceps brachii. So biceps brachii, BRACHII. Correct terminology there. And then what we talked about that just before. So what's its primary movement?
Elbow flexion.
Elbow flexion, yes. Elbow flexion during the concentric phase. Yeah. So again, just stuff that we just need to brush up on here. Okay. Number 4.
Rectus abdominis.
Yeah, rectus abdominis is correct. And what's that primary movement?
Spine flexion.
Yeah, trunk flexion. Yeah, trunk flexion we would call that. Yeah.
Trunk flexion.
Such as crunch, sit up, etc. Yeah.
Cool.
Good. Okay, let's keep going down. We're working down. Looking at 5 there. What have we got 5 there?
The rec fem.
Yep, exactly right. Rec fem. Yep. Yeah. So the rec fem has 2 roles. It's got a primary and a secondary role here. Okay. What is the primary role of the rectus femoris?
Knee extension.
Knee extension, yep, such as leg extension, such as kicking, yep. It also has a secondary role because it attaches at the hip as well. So because it crosses two joints, yeah, it crosses the knee because you can see it blends into the patella tendon there. But it
So
also
hip
crosses
flexion?
the hip. Yeah, it's important for hip flexion. So like running and things like that as well.
Okay. Cool.
So like the
Knee
back, so knee extension and hip flexion, yeah.
Okay.
Like you know when you do like a lunge stretch, when you're like in a lunge and you're stretching, you're doing the hip flexor. But if you grab the back of your foot and curl it up, then you're hitting the middle of the quad. You're hitting the rectus femoris there.
Yep.
Good. Okay. So number 6. What are we looking at? Number 6.
Vastus medialis.
Perfect. Yep. Exactly right. So there's the VMO, the vastus medialis, which is that teardrop muscle in the quad. It's a very important knee stabilizer laterally as well. But what's its primary focus? Because it's part of the quad. No, because it's part of the quadriceps. It's the same as the rectus femoris. Yeah. Yeah. So it's the same as the
so it's knee extension, hip flexion.
Well, no, it's only knee extension. So the vastus medialis doesn't cross the hip joint, so it doesn't work on the hip. It just works on the knee. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yep.
But it also provides really important lateral stability. You know, if guys have done ACLs and MCLs and stuff, they always talk about how weak that muscle gets. So that's the one that you've really got to try and work on rehabbing. You know, lots of like single leg stuff, pistol squats, and like leg extensions with your toes turned out, and that sort of stuff. Okay, so what are we at? Number 7, we're on the back side here. So what are we looking at there with number 7? Kind of a tricky one.
The traps.
Yeah, so that's the trapezius. Now, do you know, like, what do you know about the different parts of the trapezius?
Is the trap and the rhomboids and the.
Yeah, the rhomboids are separate to the. Yeah, they're kind of together, but there's three basic parts of the traps. So you've got the upper parts of the traps, which are at the top here. Okay, then you've got the middle traps, which are the middle fibers. Then you've got the lower traps, which are the lower fibers. Okay. So what you want to talk about here is the different role of all of these 3 trapezius muscles. Okay. So the upper traps, the ones that are up here at your neck, what would they be responsible for? So what joint are we looking at here? Because we're not really looking at the shoulders, we're looking at the shoulder blades, yeah? Because the trapezius work on the shoulder blades. So what's the name for the shoulder blades again?
Scapula.
Scapula, yeah. So what do the upper traps do to the scapula?
Elevate them.
Elevate them, perfect. Yep, scapular elevation. Yep, that's exactly it.
Okay.
Very good. Okay, so that would be the upper fibers. Okay, now we've also an example. So what would be like a gym exercise example for upper traps?
Shrugs.
Yeah, shrugs. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep. Okay, so what would be? What about the middle fibers of the trapezius? So the middle fibers, the ones that sit on top of the rhomboids. So what would be the role of the middle parts of the traps?
Scapular retraction.
Yeah, exactly right. So they're going to bring the scapulars back and together. Yep. And a little bit of adduction as well. So they kind of rotate the scapulars back down. So what we typically find, Shannon, is a lot of people have upper trap muscles that are really heavily developed, and they've got middle trap and lower trap muscles that are really underdeveloped, right? And that's why you see the hunching and you see the rolling forward and all that sort of stuff, yeah?
Yep.
So scapular retraction and scapular adduction. Yeah. Okay. Now, what about
scapular adduction as well?
Yeah, adduction. So they're bringing them together. Okay. So so can you think of a gym example that might hit those middle traps, like scapular retraction? What might be a gym exercise example?
Sort of bent over flies.
Yeah, bent over flies or bent over rows or cable rows or something like that. Yeah, yeah. And the rhomboids. So when you're hitting your middle traps, you're hitting your rhomboids a lot as well, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like bench pulls where when you lie.
Sorry, it
like,
was scapular retraction and adduction.
add with 2 Ds, so adding,
Yeah, that's
adduction,
right.
yeah. And then what about the lower? What about the lower fibers of the traps? So if the upper fibers do elevation, what would the lower fibers do?
Depress.
Yeah, depression, right? So they're really important because that stops the shoulders from shrugging up around the neck and, contributes to bad posture and stuff. Yeah. So, can you think of an exercise because it's a tricky example, can you think of an exercise that hits the lower trap muscles?
Lat pull down.
Lat pull downs is one. Yep, definitely.
Yep.
Scapular pull-ups. Have you ever done those before where you hang from a pull-up bar and then you just work the shoulder blades?
Yep.
Yeah, so they're examples, and they're really important. A lot of people are super weak on those because they just never really fire those muscles up. So they're really important exercises.
Gotcha.
Great. Okay. So that's 7. So hopefully we've got the upper and the middle and the lower traps covered there. All right. So what's 8?
So where it says trapezius, should I write upper, lower, and middle, or just?
I would prefer you to write trapezius, and then maybe just for like see so over here where you've got all your movements, just write upper fibers, scapular elevation, middle fibers, scapular retraction, adduction, and then lower fibers.
Okay.
So over in the other part here, Shannon. So just over on the other side here.
Okay, gotcha. So over, hang on.
Yeah.
So
just
on the side where it's
on the second column there. Yeah. So where you right there.
Upper, middle. Oops. Not there. And lower. So 8. Triceps.
Yep, number 8 is the triceps. Yeah, and what's the primary movement there?
Elbow extension.
Yeah, elbow extension. That's exactly right. Yeah. Good. Number 9.
9 is what is that? That's not the lats.
It is the lats, yeah. So that's
it's lats, yeah. Okay.
It's interesting because that's how the lats are actually oriented on the body. Okay, so that's what they look like there. So they kind of wrap around nice and long. They attach to the humerus to the upper arm bone. So they act on the shoulder joint. Yep. And so, what are some of the roles of the lat muscles? So if you think about like a cable row or a lat pull down, which is hitting the lats, what movements are the shoulders going into there? So if my arms are out and they're coming down, that would be shoulder
depression.
Where it's more adduction. Well, adduction because you're pulling.
Okay.
Adduction.
Okay.
And it's also shoulder extension because, like in a cable row, if you're pulling your shoulder behind you, that's what we call shoulder extension. So shoulder extension and it's shoulder adduction. Yeah, that's the primary role there of the lats.
Extension and shoulder adduction.
Yeah, so any pulling, rowing exercise, obviously your lats are your prime movers there because you're extending and adducting the shoulders. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. 10.
Okay. Glutes.
Yep. Glute max.
Glute max.
And primary role of glute max, Shannon?
Hip extension.
Yeah, hip extension. Okay, it's the most important, powerful athletic movement in the body is the ability to extend your hip. Running, sprinting, jumping, you name it, right? Deadlifts, kettlebell swings, all that sort of hip bridges, all that sort of stuff. Okay. 11. What's 11?
Hamstring.
Yeah, it's the hamstring. Now
Biceps
this biceps femoris.
femoris. That's right.
Biceps femoris. Yeah. So there's three hamstring.
Femoris.
Yeah, there's three hamstring muscles there: semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and the third one is the biceps femoris. Literally, the hamstrings are called the leg biceps. So, what is the role? What is the action? The prime movement of that?
Knee flexion.
Knee flexion. Yep. Leg curls.
And yep.
Yeah. So if you had to pick one, yeah.
Knee flexion.
Works a little bit with external rotation of the hip as well, but it's mainly knee flexion. Okay, that's 11, and it looks like we're on to the last one. So what's 12 there?
The gastrocs.
Yeah, gastrocnemius. Yep, exactly right. This is all pretty good for you, yeah, Shannon. I'm assuming you've come from a background in a little bit of this. So some people we just
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Some people it's kind of like the first time, but you're doing really well here. So that's the gastroc. Now, what is the primary role of the gastroc?
Ankle extension.
Yeah. Now there's a different word. There's two types of flexion in the ankle. Do you know what it is when you come up on a calf raise?
So plantar flexion.
Exactly. Yep. Great work. Yeah. Ankle plantar flexion. Typically, when the knee is straight, when the leg is straight, when the leg is bent, it's more the soleus muscle, which is the one that sits underneath. Great.
Okay. Cool.
Yep. Nice. So that's it. So understanding the major muscle groups, and then understanding their prime movements. So what are they primarily responsible for? Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, so the next question we're looking at are the three different types of muscle. Okay, so we've got three different types of muscle in our body. Do you know those three types off the top of your head?
Is this the whole what should we call it? Fast twitch and all that kind of stuff?
No, it's a little bit different. So I'll run through them. So the first type of muscle that we have is skeletal muscle. Okay, so everything that we've just talked about is what we call skeletal muscle tissue. Yeah. Okay. Now, some of the characteristics of skeletal muscle tissue is skeletal muscle tissue is what we call a voluntary control. It's under voluntary control. Yeah. So what that means is we send nervous system signals to the skeletal muscle. Yeah. So I would write it's under voluntary control. We decide when to activate it. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it creates. And then how does it create movement? It creates movement by what? What does the skeletal muscle do? How does it move the skeleton?
I don't know.
So in order for bones to move, the muscle has to pull on the bone. Yeah. So it controls movement by pulling on bones.
Okay.
Yep. So that's some of the characteristics of this type of tissue. So we send a signal to the skeletal tissue. We tell it which bone to move, and then the bone moves. Yep.
Gotcha.
Okay. And it is composed of striated. So striped.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, I didn't know if we were still going from that.
Oh yeah, no, we are. Yeah. So under voluntary control, we decide when to activate. Yeah. Causes movement by pulling on bones. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And then another one is it's if you look at skeletal muscle under a microscope, it's what we call striated. It's striped, right? So it's striated appearance. I'm not sure. I think we might have talked a little bit last week about mitochondria.
Yes.
So it's very dense in mitochondria. Has lots of energy cells within the muscle itself to provide energy. So I would rate striated appearance and very, very dense in mitochondria. Because it requires a lot of energy for it to contract to move those bones. Okay, so that's one type of muscle tissue. Okay, now what would be a second type of muscle tissue that we have in our body?
Shit, I've learned all these before, but I've just gone blank.
Okay, so the well, what about like your internal organs? So like your stomach and your digestive system and your esophagus.
Involuntary muscle.
Yeah, they're involuntary, but that's called smooth muscle. So the muscular tissue is called smooth muscle. So that's what we call it's involuntary, under involuntary control. And I would write, it is found in organs. It's found in the walls of the intestine and in arterial walls. So it's actually arteries are made up of smooth muscle. So we can't send signals to our arteries to get bigger, to send more blood. That's an involuntary response, okay? So what will actually happen to your arteries is as the signal and as the blood flow increases through the artery itself will expand and it will get bigger to allow that blood to go through.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly right, okay? And now there's one more different type of muscle. It's the heart. So it's the cardiac muscle.
Cardiac muscle, yes.
Cardiac muscle. Now, the cardiac muscle has some characteristics of skeletal muscle and some characteristics of smooth muscle. Okay, so cardiac muscle, the heart. So the heart is under involuntary control. Again, your heart rate will go up and down, stress and response to exercise. Okay. Well, you can't sit there and go, okay, heart rate go to 80, okay, heart rate go to 100. You're going to have, it's involuntary. Okay. Very good. So it's under involuntary control. Yep. Obviously, it pumps blood through the heart and body.
Pumps blood.
Yep. And it is also the difference between it and smooth muscle. It's striated in appearance like skeletal muscle. So because it is very energy dense, it has a lot of mitochondria, it's striated, etc. Because it's always working, it's always pumping, it's always requiring energy. So you can write again striated appearance and very dense in mitochondria again. So can you see, Shannon, how that one's kind of a mix of the first two? So
yes.
it's striated and it's very dense in red blood cells and dense in energy, but it's involuntary like smooth muscle. Okay,
yep.
Great. Okay, they're excellent answers, very well detailed. All right. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, so this is an interesting question. We talk about local and global muscle systems. It's not my favorite question. It's something that we had to include in the course. So we're going to have to talk about the first part is what are local muscles and what are global muscles. And then we're going to just give examples of each, okay? So I'm going to help you here a little bit. So a global muscle, okay, is they're muscles that move the trunk without being directly attached to the vertebrae, to the spine. Okay. So these are the global muscles. So these are like the what we call the muscles on the outside of the trunk. Okay. So for that, I would write muscles for global muscles. So in the other column, I would write a group of muscles that move the trunk without being directly attached to the vertebrae, so they're not directly attached to the spine itself. Yeah. Okay. Now, obviously, the local muscles would be the opposite of that. So these are muscles that are attached to the spine. So I would write like muscles. Yeah, muscles that are located, muscles that attach to the spine that provide spinal stability. Okay. So the difference is global. Global are like. So imagine if you're like, if I'm doing crunches and leg raises and twists and stuff, I'm using the global muscles, right? But if I'm sitting here and there are these tiny little muscles that are keeping my spine upright, they are the local muscles. Okay, so let's see if we can kind of figure out which is which, okay? So let's start with the global muscles. So what are some of the big muscles attached to our trunk, our big abdominal muscles that help to move the spine?
Rectus
Yeah, so the rectus abdominis would be one. So I put
rectus abdominis.
Yep.
Yep. So that's global, right?
Yeah, that would be a global muscle because it moves the trunk, but it's not attached to the spine. Yeah. What would be another one? So what muscles provide like rotational movements of the trunk? Like
obliques.
Yeah, so external obliques. So like Russian twists and twisting ball slams and all that sort of stuff. Yep.
Yep.
And what might be a third one? What about the hip flexors? So the iliops, the hip flexors, which is called the iliopsoas. So I would write iliop, ILIOP.
ILIOP.
SOAS.
SOAS.
Yeah, and then I would write in brackets like hip flexors. Yeah, so they're three. They move the trunk, but without being directly attached to the vertebrae. Excellent. Okay. So then, what about the deeper muscles? So there are three really specific deep muscles that give us the stability in around our spine.
Psoas?
No, because the psoas is part of the hip flexor.
Okay.
So like when you're working so you know when you say like you're working a plank, right? What are those really deep muscles called? The ones that like kind of wrap around your spine like a weight belt.
Transverse abdominis.
Perfect. Excellent, Shannon. Yep, transverse abdominis. So they would be local muscles because they're deep and they actually attach to the spine. Yep.
Gotcha.
Yeah, transverse abdominis. Great. So with abdominis, it's IS at the end.
Oh. And
yeah. Okay. So then if you've got external obliques, but what you've also got underneath those attached to the spine are internal obliques. Yeah. Yeah, and then the last one's a muscle group that not a lot of people know much about. These are the ones that attach from they might attach from like the L5 to the L4, then from the L4 to the L3, then the L3 to the L2. They run right up your spine like a Christmas tree. Yeah. Do you know what they're called? Start with an M. They're the deepest postural muscles in the spine.
What is it? The multiv?
Yeah, you're 90% there. Multifidus. Excellent. Yeah, yep. Great. Really good, mate. Yeah, multifidus. Okay.
Multifidus.
So the best way to kind of understand this is the global muscles are the ones that provide movement in the trunk, and the local muscles are the ones that, when we do like the isometric stuff, they provide the stability. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
So now in C, we have to talk about what are those movements they're responsible for. Yeah. Explain the function of each muscle. Okay. So rectus abdominis. So we know that one is trunk flexion. Yep. What's the external obliques responsible for?
Rotation.
Yeah, trunk rotation. Yeah. And then hip flexors, hip flexion.
Yeah. Hip flexion.
Hip flexion, yeah. And that's part of the trunk because that's things like leg raises and that helps to tuck the pelvis underneath and all that sort of stuff. Okay. Now, these are tricky ones because these ones typically aren't required for movement. Okay. So what the transverse abdominis one is responsible for is spinal stabilization. Okay. Particularly the lumbar. So you know, like the lumbar part of the spine, the bottom part of the spine. Yeah. So I would write like maybe lumbar spine stabilization, and then I would write something about it like it flattens the abdominal wall as well. Yeah. So we talk about like in that like flat stomach. Yeah.
So right, put that in there with the
I would do that as well. Yeah, I would do that. Yeah, lumbar spine stabilization. It flattens the abdominal wall. Yeah.
Abdominal.
Okay, so now let's think about this. So if the external obliques rotate the trunk, yeah, what would the internal obliques do? Remember, they're a stabilizing muscle. So what would they do? Have you ever done the exercise in the gym? You probably have, where it's called the Pallof press, where you hold the resistance band and you press it out in front of you and you hold it in front of you, and it's coming from the side. Yeah.
Yep.
So like with that exercise, what is your trunk doing? What is it resisting? So it's
the force trying to pull you, to rotate you.
To rotate you, yeah. So we would call that anti-rotation. Yeah.
Okay.
So I would write. So the role of the internal obliques is to resist trunk rotation. Yeah. So
resist trunk rotation.
Yeah, it's resisting trunk rotation because.
So write that.
Yeah, definitely. So why might that be important for someone, say like a track sprinter? Why would be that anti-rotation? Why would that movement be important to train?
Because they have that counter rotation. Like when they're running, when they're engaging in their slings, they've got that. The rotation has to kind of whip, but also stay kind of steady at the same time, so their spine's not all over the place.
Yeah, exactly right. And also they don't want to overcompensate with that rotation by rotating their trunk too much and coming off that line. Because if you think about running, if I'm trying to run this way, but my trunk is doing this, I'm wasting a lot of energy as well. Yeah.
Yes.
So those internal obliques are working really strongly to resist rotation, allow that you're right, that sling of movement from the hip flexor into the opposite arm. Exactly right.
Yep.
Okay. So that's
it's
a very, very important concept, and we need to train that a lot with people. As you probably wear through like functional patterns and stuff, it's not so much training movements, but training to resist unwanted movements. Yeah. So, and that's where it all comes down to movement efficiency. Now, what does the multifidus do? Do we know that one? Very similar to the transverse, but what it does, it provides segment by segment spine stabilization. So it'll stabilize each individual vertebrae all the way up. Yeah.
It's stable.
We'll stabilize the spine segment by segment or something like that.
We'll stabilize the spine.
Yeah, or we'll stabilize each spinal segment. So the multifidus is, very, very important. So, for example, if I was to sit here and if I was to rotate just 2 degrees, the tiniest movement, those tiny trunk movements, that's my multifidus working. As soon as I rotate this far, that's the obliques working. Yeah. So the multifidus does the tiny movements, and then the obliques take over for the big movements. Right. So you can imagine how important the multifidus is when you're doing like really heavy squats, like a power lifter, right? Like if you've got 300 kilos on your back, you want your multifidus to be able to stabilize each segment, because if one of them goes out, you're in big trouble. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So that's
understood.
Yes, that's the difference there between the global segments and the local segments. Okay. Question 8.4. Now, this is a little bit of physiology here about how what's the order of muscle contraction. This isn't the most exciting question. Okay. So let's kind of put it in order. So the first thing that happens, we're talking about the signal coming from the nerves to the muscles and then the muscle contracting. Okay. So the first thing that happens, the first step, is the motor neuron. So the neuron is the nerve cell. So the motor neuron activation is the first step. Okay, so how would I describe this role? I would describe this as a signal, or what we call, a signal or action potential. That's what we call a nervous system signal, as an action potential. Yeah, is sent from the central nervous system. So from the brain to the spinal cord. You just write send from the central nervous system.
Can I abbreviate like that?
That's perfect. A signal action potential is sent from the CNS through the spinal cord and reaches the muscle. Really trying to keep it in more like layman's terms because you can go into more detail here. But yeah, that's the best way to do that. Okay.
Okay.
So the second part from here is a nerve impulse. Okay, so the second part would be the nerve impulse, and that's when the impulse runs through the muscle, or through the nerve. Sorry. So I would say I would write the impulse travels. So the impulse, which is the signal of the nerve, travels through the axon, which is the center of the nerve, through the axon to the motor unit, which is the part of the muscle that receives the nerve signal. Okay, so the nerve that connects to the muscle, it's traveling to that portion of the nerve, which is the motor unit. It's called a motor end plate. That's fine, which is part of the muscle that receives the signal. Okay, now the third part is there's a little transfer of energy here. So the third part is what we call the acetylcholine release. Again, this is kind of very dry little science stuff. So you can see it up there, the acetylcholine release. So see it up right up the top there, acetylcholine, release. Okay, so, and then you would write acetylcholine is released into the, sorry, I know this is a shitty question, into the, what we call the synaptic cleft. So the SYNAPTIC, synaptic cleft, at the axon terminal, which is the end of the axon that receives that neurotransmitter. So this is the actual impulse here.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Good. Then the next one would be polarization. Yeah. So neuromuscular depolarization would be the next one. How can I explain this in? Oh, okay. Yeah. And then I would write calcium is released. So calcium is a very important part of nerve transmission. Calcium is released into the muscle, which exposes the binding sites of the actin. So I'm not sure if you remember, actin and myosin connect in the muscle and they pull on each other, which causes the muscle to contract. Sites of the actin molecule, ACTIN, molecule, And then the next one is what we call, the last one is we call sarcomere shortening. Then I would write there, actin and myosin molecules bind, actin and myosin, MYOSIN, they're the two cells within the muscle. MYOSIN,
MYOSIN,
bind together and pull, which shortens the sarcomere and contracts the muscle fiber. That's just the physiology there behind. Yeah, good. So it's the starts from the signal which comes from the brain to the spinal cord, all the way through from the nerve into the muscle, which releases calcium. Calcium opens up the bonding site for actin, then myosin connects, and then they pull together like this, and then the muscle shortens, and that happens all the way along the length of the muscle. Muscle contracts. Okay, good, mate.
Wow.
Yeah, it's physiology. This is one of these like 80-20 things. Like you'll learn it, and then you will. It doesn't really have a practical application. But the only real practical application there is that calcium is really important for nervous system conduction and muscle contraction. So people that can be deprived of calcium, and potassium is another really important molecule. So one of the hypothesis behind why muscles cramp is because of lack of potassium. Potassium causes the nervous system signals to misfire, which causes the muscles to, cramp is an involuntary muscle contraction. Yeah. So that's why, Gatorade and sports drinks and all that sort of stuff typically have calcium and potassium and sodium and all these things in there. All right, mate. So that's 4C done. Okay. So again, I know this is a bit of a drier module, but that's that one finished. Okay. So again, we'll need you to have to do those takeaways, but we can just leave this now. We can close this down. This is saved real time.